I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, an editor at Bloomberg Opinion. Joining me today are Lisa Jarvis, Bloomberg Opinion's health and pharmaceuticals columnist, and Daniel Skovronsky, Eli Lilly's chief scientific and medical officer and president of Lilly Research Laboratories. Thank you both for being here today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So we're going to be talking first about the new drugs that people can't seem to stop talking about, the new class of injectable weight loss drugs that actually seem to work to help people lose weight. But there is a key question: are insurers going to pay for them, and what needs to happen in order for that to happen? Then we'll also talk about some of the new advances in treating Alzheimer's that Lilly has been leading the charge on. And we'll ask Dan about how he's helped to lead Lilly's comeback over the past decade. But first, let's start by talking about some of these new weight loss drugs. Dan, I'd love to know more about what it's been like to be involved in discovering drugs like these. Were you looking for a weight loss drug, or were you hunting for something else?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We're working on a medicine called tirzepatide. It's under FDA review, actually, for treatment of obesity. But it started its life as a medicine for type 2 diabetes. We were actually looking at mechanisms in your body that can treat diabetes. And it turns out, we've known this for a long time, that there's a very close interrelationship between obesity and type 2 diabetes. These are diseases that have some common etiologies. And in fact, obesity is one of the most common causes of type 2 diabetes. And it turns out they have similar treatments, and that's what unlocked the science of treating obesity for us.
That's fascinating. And, you know, one of the challenges I think that Lisa and I have sometimes run into in covering this is that it is sometimes the conversation around weight loss is still so moralistic rather than medical. Lisa, I'm wondering, have we lost? Are you still there, Lisa? I just want to make sure you can still hear us. Okay, we're having some trouble connecting with Lisa. All right, we'll come back to that question. So I'd love to know, Dan, what you make of some of the reports about people who are taking some of these weight loss drugs and saying it's also helping them with other forms of compulsive behavior. So alcohol, for example, or other forms of addictive or compulsive behavior. Do you think that there is something behind those sort of anecdotal reports that some of these weight loss drugs do have a mechanism that maybe helps people deal with other sorts of behaviors?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is probably, unfortunately, it's still too soon to know. I think what we do feel comfortable with the science behind is that when you treat obesity, that treats a number of diseases, or even potentially prevents diseases that are caused by obesity. But the things you're asking about, compulsive or addictive behaviors, we don't actually think of as a result of obesity. Now, how do these work? It's mostly through their effects on signaling that connects your gastrointestinal tract, your stomach and your intestines, with your brain. And these signals tell you, that you're full and stop eating. They tell your body to energize, to metabolize energy when you've eaten. That's how these drugs in general work. But one of the sites of action is absolutely in the brain, and we're trying to understand if there could be other benefits from this drug. It's interesting to see those reports on social media for sure.
Yeah, well, and I know you had mentioned to Lisa that there are some studies that you're doing that are looking at some of the other health benefits of these drugs, things like maybe sleep apnea or cardiovascular effects. Do you feel like that kind of connection, drawing out those sorts of connections, is really important to have these drugs be taken seriously and covered by insurers?
Yeah, I think that's right, Sarah. You were earlier sort of, going down the path of some people don't yet see obesity as a disease, but yet we know, I think the medical literature is rich with evidence that obesity leads to these other conditions. And if you can treat obesity, in the past, really, we could only have a great treatment with obesity with bariatric surgery. Actual surgeries to reduce the stomach, and those have a great effect on obesity. And then what we found is that when you do that, you can reduce the impact of liver disease. It nearly goes away completely. You can certain kind of liver disease called NASH. You reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and help patients with heart failure and prevent type 2 diabetes. So that was all shown with surgery, and now we're systematically reproducing that using the medicines that can lead to weight loss to show that we can get the same effect from these drugs. Because I think all of these effects are secondary to body weight. It's not that the medicine itself has a direct effect on these diseases, but by losing weight, we think we can reverse obstructive sleep apnea and obesity. We can prevent heart failure in patients with obesity. We can probably improve kidney health, and that's ongoing now as a trial and other indications.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, we just are to let people know Lisa was having some connection problems, so she's going to reconnect. Lisa, is this any better? Okay, great.
Now I couldn't hear Dan before. My apologies.
Well, I'm glad you're back, and you're just in time, because we were just starting to talk about something that you and I have spoken about as you've written columns on treatment of obesity, which is that despite the abundance of evidence showing the important health effects of losing weight, and also how difficult it is to lose weight based on sheer willpower alone for many, many people, there still is this sort of moralistic strain in the conversation where people seem to think, well, can't people just try harder? Why do they really need an expensive drug to help them lose weight? Can't they just eat less and exercise more? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about why that attitude hasn't resulted in success, and also maybe how we move past it.
Yeah, I mean, in the last year or two have talked to a lot of obesity medicine specialists and patients who are taking these drugs, and the common theme is that this isn't just about their appearance. They have tried so many different things, have been so frustrated, and frankly, it's hard to feel unsuccessful when you've tried a lot of different things and it's not helping. And a lot of folks have health measures that they would like to resolve. They are pre-diabetic, they have high blood pressure, they have joint and back issues. And when they've tried these drugs, it's the first thing that's helped them, which is pretty amazing to hear their stories of how instantly things changed for them. Of course, that's not to say that there aren't side effects and a whole host of other things that you want to think about. But, at the same time, the stigma hasn't lifted. There still is this attitude about willpower, needing to be the thing that, kind of motivates weight loss. I would love to say that data showing the health benefits, as we see more of that come out, will shift the conversation. I think it will for some people. We've seen during COVID that data isn't always the most compelling driver of people's attitudes, unfortunately. But I think it's going to be a process, and I really hope that over time, as more people know others, I just feel like so many times when I ask, I want to talk to a patient, can someone connect me to someone? I get so many people who reach out to me that they have been starting on this drug, and then a family member starts on the drug after because they see, and I just feel like, we may see a trickle effect as people start to realize that, they can have a pretty big benefit, and that it isn't just about, appearance, that it's about your overall health.
Yeah. One comment from our side, Lisa, when we do clinical trials, we always include a placebo group, and usually that's not particularly interesting. But in our obesity trials, it was fascinating because these were patients who really wanted a treatment for obesity, so much so that they're out there volunteering to be in a clinical trial. So they're highly motivated. They're given diet and exercise as tools, and they meet with doctors to receive counseling and encouragement. And they think maybe they're on a drug too. And so it's a pretty intensive program for these patients. And 72 weeks out, which is the duration of the trial, they lost 2.5%, which is something. Diet and exercise work, but it's not a lot. Very few of them lost, more significant amounts, and people on the drug lost about 22% of their body weight. But looking at the placebo group, you realize all of this idea that if you just tried harder, if you were more motivated, diet and exercise, talk to your doctor, for most people, it's not going to have a big effect. And yet our medical system is still set up where that's sort of the primary counseling to patients. When we talk to patients who are on the drug in the clinical trials, they often tell us the biggest effect wasn't really the weight loss. It was me realizing that this wasn't a problem with myself, that this wasn't a willpower issue, that this was a medical issue that can be treated with a medicine. So encouraging to hear that. It's just the beginning, I think, of what I hope will be a change in society.
So interesting to hear about that dramatic difference between the placebo group and the group in treatment. And to me, one of the big sort of obstacles I keep hearing about here, there's sort of twofold obstacles. One is cost, obviously, especially if it's not covered by insurance. But the other is the format. These drugs are injectable. And I think a lot of people express interest and then they find out it's injectable and they're like, oh, maybe actually not. A lot of people are afraid of needles. You have to go to the doctor's office to get it. Maybe, I think people assume that if something's a pill or a patch, it's just easier. And I'm just wondering, what are the odds of something like this drug becoming available in a format that is a little bit more accessible to people?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sarah. Our drug is currently available for people with type 2 diabetes who have more experience with injectable drugs. So I don't really have a basis for understanding yet for people who don't have that experience. But in that population, once a week injection is well tolerated. I think there's trepidation at the beginning. People are scared. It's reasonable to be scared of a needle, I think. But when they try it, then most people realize it's not a real big deal. On the other hand, it's still an obstacle. It's an obstacle for some patients who've never had an injectable and don't want to be on one. It's an obstacle because it's difficult to make the injectables and the devices, and difficult to distribute them around the world, and they require refrigeration. So when we think about 1 billion people in the world by 2030 suffering from overweight or obesity who might want treatment, I don't think it's reasonable to think that 1 billion people are going to be taking injections every week from plastic devices. So we're trying to work on pill versions. It's not exactly the same drug, but we hope to have a similar effect. And our most advanced oral molecule just entered the final stage of phase 3 clinical testing. The data from phase 2 look good. We have in this last stage how it works in a larger group of patients, but I hope in just a couple of years, if that trial is successful, we'll have a pill available as well for people that is easy to use and once a day.
Mm-hmm. My last question on this before we get into Alzheimer's, is around the duration of treatment because, Dan, you mentioned that with patients with diabetes, they're used to having a sort of certain amount of medical intervention in their lives. And I think if you have diabetes, you know that you're going to be managing that for your life. I think for the sort of general public that's shown so much interest in these weight loss drugs, the idea of, oh, but I have to take it indefinitely has been a little bit of a surprise, a wake-up call, a downside. I'm not quite sure what to call it. It's not what they want. They want a course of treatment and then for it to be over. And I guess I'm wondering, are there any horizons on that front that you see? And Lisa, maybe I'll start here with you and then we go back to Dan before moving to Alzheimer's.
Well, I've certainly been watching all the different types of drugs that are being developed, some of which are kind of longer acting, so maybe you don't have to inject every day. But, I'm very interested in this question. I'd love to hear what Dan has to say because I'm curious, how hard it will be to sort of think about alternate dosing. Does it have to, Dan, maybe you have some thoughts on whether, there could be longer term ways to maintain your kind of plateau weight that you've lost without having to take the drug each week.
We just, Lisa's having some technical issues. So Dan, let's just jump to how you'd answer that question.
Yeah, I heard the gist of it, and I agree with your comment, Lisa. It's something that a lot of people feel like, why do I need to take this medicine for the rest of my life? And I understand it and agree, actually. I wish that they didn't have to. Of course, I think when people start going to the gym or working on diet, as a way of treating overweight, that is probably easier to come to grips with as a lifelong commitment. And of course, when we take medicine for high blood pressure or for high cholesterol, we usually think about that as a lifelong thing too. So as we come to think more and more of obesity as a disease, probably the switch flips a little more. But even so, we know for many chronic diseases like obesity or type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, a lot of times people get tired of taking their medicine for various reasons and they stop and then they have adverse consequences of their chronic disease. It gets worse. And so it would be great if we can have medicines that have a really long duration. Could it be a once a year drug? Or really, I think for us, the holy grail could be, could we even set the set point in your brain that controls your body weight? And I think people are beginning to understand this better, but the idea is here, we're all walking around with like a thermostat in our brain that's trying to get us to a certain body weight. And if you're below that body weight, which may be obesity, if you're below that, your brain is telling you, I'm starving, we need to eat more, we need to burn less calories. It's very hard to fight that. If anyone's ever sort of someone who doesn't have obesity, if they've ever fasted for a day and the next day they're really, really hungry, people with obesity feel that way, if they're anything below their set point. So can we change that set point in a long-lasting way in the brain? I don't think the current crop of drugs offer that, at least not for most patients. There might be some who get that benefit. We don't know. But we're working on trying to understand mechanisms in the brain that could do that. That's a new frontier. It's great to see all of the science opening up in treatment of this disease that just a few years ago wasn't even recognized as a disease. So I think it's the beginning of a great time period for helping people with this illness.
Well, speaking of new frontiers, I'd love to pivot now to Alzheimer's. And I'm actually going to start with Lisa here because Lisa was the one who explained to me why Lilly's advances here were such a breakthrough. And I'd rather have her do that so that I'm not putting you in the position of having to hype yourself. So Lisa, explain to us briefly, if you can, why you were so excited about this breakthrough.
Well, I think, as we know, that decades have gone by with many, many, many failures in Alzheimer's, and the drugs that we currently have up until recently, the drugs we currently had only treated the symptoms of the disease and not the underlying cause of the disease, couldn't slow down the progression. And so, Lilly and, there's another drug as well called Leqembi from Biogen and Eisai. Both of these actually slow down for the first time the progression of the disease. It doesn't cure it, but I feel like offers real hope that, we're finally getting some traction on helping families who have had really nothing that can help them over the years.
I'd love to, Dan, hear from you about how you helped get us to this point because, my grandfather 20 years ago died of complications from Alzheimer's, and it's just such a horrible disease. And to have any hope here is so astonishing. How did we get here?
Yeah. Sorry about your grandfather, and it's so hard on the family members too. It's not a disease that just affects the patient. When I started working on Alzheimer's disease in almost 25 years ago, it wasn't possible to see the pathology of the disease. So we could only see the symptoms, not like cancer where you can do a scan and see the tumor, you can take a biopsy and understand. All we could do was talk to the patient and give them memory tests. And the drugs that we had and the people working on, all they could do is sort of offer temporary symptomatic relief. At that time, I think me, along with many, many people in the field, said if we could just change that, if we could actually detect the pathology in the brain in people and then target drugs to change that pathology, we could have a more lasting disease modifying type of effect here on Alzheimer's disease. It's taken literally 20 years to do that. And it's been successive iterations of building better and better tools. I started my career in Alzheimer's disease working to develop imaging tests. And we made an imaging test that can see first the main, initial pathology of Alzheimer's disease that we think of as the amyloid plaques in the brain. We can now see that. The next innovation we had was an imaging agent that could see the other pathology, the tangles. Now we have blood tests that we've created, so we can just draw a sample of blood and measure those proteins. Building on the back of that advance, then we were able to make drugs more and more powerful against removing the plaques. Because now we could see what we're aiming for, and we could see if the drug removed a little bit of plaque, as our first drugs did, they weren't good enough. Could we make ones that removed all of the plaque and ultimately test those in patients? So we had to build the tools first so we could see what we were doing, and then we could test the drugs. And finally, we get to the stage where we've now had two potential medicines now pass phase 3 clinical trials with success. They're not cures for Alzheimer's yet, but with our drug, we're seeing, something in the range of 30 to 40% slowing of disease progression in many patients, which I think is going to be very meaningful if we can give people years, hopefully back with their families at a high level of functioning, that could make a difference. The medicines aren't perfect. As I said, they don't fully stop the disease course, and they also have serious side effects that need to be carefully monitored, and patients and doctors need to think about when they think about whether these are the right medicines for that. Our medicine that was successful in clinical trials, or potential medicine, I should say, is currently under FDA review, and we hope it'll be a real medicine soon.
It's so exciting, and some progress here after so many years without progress. It's just so exciting, because it is such a devastating disease, and as you said, does affect the families too so deeply. Um, I'm wondering, Lisa, how easy or hard is it for patients to kind of get screened for early signs of Alzheimer's? I know, like with cancer, if you find a lump, people usually are like very quick to do follow-up tests to find out what that is. How would you compare sort of getting screened for early signs of Alzheimer's?
Well, my impression from talking to neurologists about is that the arrival of these drugs is kind of changing the paradigm of who would get screened. I mean, the availability of the test that Dan helped bring to market of a PET scan to kind of show that you had amyloid plaque on the brain was important, but not always accessible. But now there's a reason that people should get screened because there's a treatment, right, for them. I think screening is one piece of it, but there's a whole infrastructure that has to change in order to support the arrival of these drugs and people getting now a different kind of treatment my feeling is going to take some time to develop. And so it's not like overnight, you'll go in, get your screen or your blood test, and the next day, you get these drugs. There's conversations that have to happen about, some of the side effects, and helping patients decide if they're right for them. And then, getting those screens, being registered so that they can be tracked, and then, going in regularly to actually get the infusion, which I've heard from some neurologists actually could help overall improve patients' well-being, because they will go from seeing a doctor less regularly to more regularly with their family. And I've been told that kind of constant contact is also part of, helping families do better. Patients.
Oh, that was super interesting to hear. I'm sorry you got cut off, Lisa.
I know Lisa's there must be a storm over Chicago today.
But I totally agree with what you were saying. And I just remember there was a time where I used to say we're in a vicious cycle in Alzheimer's disease, where the people working on diagnostics would say, well, why should we make a diagnostic test? Because no one's going to, there's no reason to diagnose if you can't treat. And the people making the treatment said, we can't make better treatments because we can't diagnose the right patients. We can't find them early enough. And so there was no progress. And then, now I hope we've switched to a virtuous cycle where we have diagnostic tests and we have treatments, and they could each stimulate each other to get better and to get used more. So I hope we're in that stage of Alzheimer's disease treatment now.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know we just have a couple minutes left, but so Dan, I wanted to ask you a follow-up based on something that you and Lisa had talked about in a Q&A that you did together earlier, which is you had said that one key to the transformation at Lilly over the last decade is that you were able to decide that your organizing principle in the department would be speed. I think there's a lot of managers out there who would love to know how to make that happen on their teams or in their company. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that and how that actually came to be?
Yeah, well, in drug development, it's really hard. And I think we just have to be super humble that even people doing all the right, people who are highly motivated, working hard, sometimes just won't be successful. And we had the good fortune to be working, I think, at some of the scientific areas that had breakthroughs. We contributed to those, but we were, surely lucky in some of the choices we made. But speed was not that. It was a deliberate choice. And in drug development, you can work on, can I make drug development cheaper? Could I improve my success rate? Could I improve the quality of the data package, more information about each step, or speed? And we chose speed. And initially people said, well, if you choose speed, you'll sacrifice cost and quality. You can't have all three, like the sign at the restaurant. But we defied that a little bit, said, no, we're going to keep the quality high. We're going to keep the cost reasonable, although drug development is very expensive, but we're going to focus on getting faster. And we started to look at every step in the process and say, how much shorter could it be? How can we plan for success and invest in advance? But probably the most important thing is just a cultural one. And sometimes people don't want to go fast because they're afraid if we set an ambitious timeline and then we miss it a little bit, we'll be penalized. And so we tried to create a safe space to say we'd rather have teams with very ambitious goals that then they miss a little bit than have goals that they're 95% confident in and they always hit. And I think that's an important change is creating that environment, especially in science where it's so hard to get things right. I'd rather have scientists and drug developers set really hard goals and then miss them sometimes, but still do better than they could have done in a different kind of environment where perfection is what you demand.
Well, and you also said, I think, if I remember correctly, that you were going to follow the science and do the cool science and not worry so much about the commercial pull. So it's sort of ironic that you've ended up with this cool weight loss drug and this cool Alzheimer's drug, which are very big commercial potentials.
Sure. We've made a lot of drugs. Not all of them have huge commercial potential. And I always look at them and think, sometimes we've cracked really hard science and important problems. I always think of an example in migraine where we and others have had real breakthroughs, and the drugs haven't turned into massive commercial success, but they're still helping a lot of people. The science part of drug development is maybe easier and more predictable, even though it's really hard. And then the social aspects, I think, Lisa, you were talking about the pandemic before. The great science isn't always enough, and sometimes we have great science and either because of payers who don't want to pay for medicine or the doctors who are slow to change their treatment practice, a misunderstanding of what patients need, they end up not really having the impact we thought they would. If we could have more progress in that area of how to change public behavior to improve health, I think that we need that to catch up to the science. We saw it in the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of progress, but still some work to do. Well, thank you both for spending some time with us this morning. I learned a lot and I appreciate your time. Thanks for hanging in there with us through some technical challenges, and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you both.
Bye.